Welcome to our lecture series, last lecture of the winter quarter. We are so delighted to have Simone Nicole Savannah with us today. I just wanted to start with saying that I am in Olympia near Evergreen, and that's at the base of the Puget Sound, and it's ceded territories of the Medicine Creek Treaty Tribes, which include the Squaxin Island Tribe, the Nisqually Island Tribe, the Puyallup Tribe of Indians. And the Olympia area was historically a center for trade. You see all this water that comes down here, and exchange among many Salish sea tribes. And with this awareness, we honor the ancestors and pay respect to elders past, but also present. We have a pretty active Indigenous community here. I also want to point out to everyone the question and answer format that we will have a QA that you can type into, but you can also raise your hand and then ask Savannah questions in person and have it more of an in-person dialogue, which I sort of think is nicer, especially for the speaker who's out in this world of just looking at themselves on a monitor. This spring, I just want to bring up the spring quarter. We'll be coordinating with both the Jose Gomez Farm Worker Justice Day and the Climate Series and the Reimagining Community Safety. So it's going to be a nice collaboration, more of a collaboration with other groups in the spring. And I'm going to turn this over to Okoye Harris, who's a student in Black Girl Magic, and who has agreed to introduce Simone Nicole Savannah for us. Thanks, Okoye.
Hi, thank you. My name is Okoye Harris, and I am in the program Black Girl Magic, Black Female Literary Arts in 21st Century Context. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Simone Savannah. She is a writer, performer, teacher, used to be a dancer like myself, from Columbus, Ohio. Dr. Savannah earned her Master's of Education and Bachelor of Arts from Ohio University. She holds a Ph.D. in creative writing from the University of Kansas. Dr. Savannah is the author of Uses of My Body, which was selected by Jericho Brown as the winner of the Barrow Street Poetry Prize. This 2020 debut contemplates an array of experiences that are essential to, but not limited to, living in a Black femme body, such as autonomy over oneself, erasure, physical intimacy, navigating forms of power and violence. Dr. Savannah also authored the chapbook Like Kansas, which was published in 2018. Yesterday, I had the honor of taking a poetry workshop with her, where we not only got to dissect what Black Girl Magic is through watching and discussing poetry, we also got to create works of our own. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaw, and thank you so much, Okoye, for that lovely introduction. I had a blast yesterday in the Black Girl Magic program. We discussed tons of poems and had a good conversation. So today, what I'm going to do for you is read through some of my work and then talk a little bit about the literary works that I've sort of grounded my performances in, as well as my poetry. So I'll start with the poem, Like Want for Having. Sometimes it is the yellow spotted bananas on my refrigerator that make me think of you. Not for your touch or for the chocolate, but because of the time you went to work and left me at your place, said that if I got hungry, I could have anything I wanted. I thought if you had bananas, I would crump dance in your kitchen. But no, you did not have bananas. So I ate your peanuts and drank your last bottle of water. Thought about how you said I could have anything. I wondered if hunger is why women get married, not for the bananas, but for the company and for the having of absolutely anything. I wonder now if hunger is why men send me strange messages about how they want to spit in my throat or call me baby or sweetheart and ask me to say what I want to do with their dicks and my tongue. I've only wanted to eat you and ripe bananas, and sometimes only want you and I dancing in your living room, taking shots of Red Bull in 1800, like you have no idea I conjured you. If my mother were alive. If my mother were alive, we'd talk about our men. We'd laugh, throw our heads back and push each other at the shoulders. Say, remember the man you left early in the morning, the day you got dad to say that he was gay so that what's his name wouldn't think you were still sleeping with him. She'd tell me that not all men can be conquered that easily. She had wanted to be really loved by men, but they only sought her because she was beautiful. My second cousin calls me Tracy sometimes. She says I sound like my mother when I laugh. And she says, I don't take men seriously either. I only want to fuck them. I want to tell her it's because I am Black and a woman. I want a chance at my own body. Mommy's surgery was her having a chance at her own body. She fucks men because we have all learned to fuck men. But I think Pam knows all of this. She is a Black woman too. She knows the lives of men because each of the men she married died. They widowed her. She tries not to remember running to the alley and discovering bullet holes in her second husband's chest. I want to know why my mother wanted the surgery, position herself as fixable. And I'm going to read one last poem before I begin my lecture. Personal, or how do I write about this shit in a dissertation? The second time I watched Spike Lee's She Gotta Have It, I was in an undergraduate film course, feminist film course, where we read bell hooks, who argued Nola Darling isn't free at all. Her unabashed sexuality was written for men, by men trying to clear their names. My white classmates say, poor Black girl, or something similar. And my professor said, yes, race, woman, look at itness. And we began marking the moments at which Nola's body is not on screen or being touched. Nola's body is everywhere, always being touched. I am not sure if I am Nola Darling or not Nola Darling, or trying to resist being Nola Darling, overdetermined, written to be gazed at, trying to gaze back, but wait for it. My body is mine, but many men too will say they've had it because they have had it, or they want me to promise them my body. Academia makes me write a dissertation to clear my name. I begin, I am not a Jezebel. My body has been made up. My erotic has been made up. And actually, I am or want to be angry about it. Some attempt at a blues woman. I read poems to remake the self. I write poems to remake the self. My mother tried to remake her body, but died as soon as she began. I'm going to share my screen. In Notes for an Oppositional Poetics, Erica Hunt writes, oppositional poetics and cultures form a field of related projects which have been moved beyond skepticism to a critically active stance against forms of domination. She considers an expanded sense of poetics as one that invokes strategies for disrupting the binaries of fact and fiction, and of identity and non-identity, ultimately closing the distance between writing and experience. For communities of color in particular, she argues that an oppositional poetics grows out of a long history of discrimination and marginalization by the dominant culture. This long history has fostered a collective identity and forms of resistance that are critical to survival. The objective of oppositional poet projects and those intellectuals who so engage is to continue to locate themselves within a collective process, particularly to find example and value with which to fuel present resistance to racism, sexism, classism, and even meaningless alterations to the dominant culture's terms. Oppositional writers in particular, whose practices have been shaped by social movements and their demand for social transformation, produce critical views in language. My poetry collections, like Kansas and Uses of My Body, grew out of my critical interests in oppositional poetics expressed in the work produced by women and women writers of color, throughout the 20th and 21st century. I find in their fiction, poems, essays, songs, films, and plays, explorations and examinations of women's complex subjectivities, as well as strategies of resistance against the oppression they experience in their specific political and social lives. The opposition resists power and domination and seeks to remove the distance, again, between writing and experience. I read women's oppositional writing as a literature shaped by the demands of social transformation, a process that critically engages words and consciousness. These writers invent as well as work within and against literary traditions and various social movements, the feminist movements, Black arts, Black power, Black Lives Matter even, to provide insight into women's complex subjectivities. They construct and maintain literary spaces through which women writers can gain visibility as well as personal and political autonomy. I examine my own writing, my poetry in particular, in oppositional terms. Like Kansas began as a scattered number of notes and personal stories about sex and sexuality, and about my living in Kansas, attending a predominantly white institution as a Black woman. I noticed common themes of race, gender, and sexuality connecting them. The poems mostly focus on body and consider the historical perceptions of Black womanhood and the Black female body. I began discussing that history in connection with my current living, particularly the racial and sexual microaggressions that I confronted in my daily life. I found myself merging and juxtaposing details of my personal life with those of other Black women's lives, including my mother's. I intended to compose an oppositional narrative that explored the complexities of Black womanhood and resistance, locating my confrontations with issues of race, sex, and class within the collective. In Uses of My Body, discussions of anger, the erotic, and the personal converge with my readings of Black feminist literature and scholarship. My goal, again, is to establish an oppositional poetics that is deliberate in its quest for survival and autonomy, and in its examination of racial and sexual politics. My confessional pieces and poetry performances assist me in articulating theories and concerns in Black feminist literature, or feminist literature more generally, as they relate to my experiences of erasure, sexual and racial violence, and also of pleasure and healing. My title borrows from Audre Lorde's essays, Uses of the Erotic and Uses of Anger. In Uses of the Erotic, Lorde distinguishes the erotic from the pornographic. Patriarchy and the male gaze have vilified and devalued the erotic by limiting the exercise of the erotic as the service women provide to men. Women, she argues, have been taught only by the suppression of the erotic within our lives and consciousness can women truly be strong. Misnamed by men and used against women, the erotic has been equated with the pornographic, which Lorde argues is an opposite and direct denial of women's power to make their lives more possible and less difficult or absent of oppression. She writes that empowered women are dangerous. So we are taught to separate the erotic demand from the most vital areas of our lives other than sex. Lorde is speaking of the erotic as a life source of women, the creative energy that empowers women, the knowledge and use of it to reclaim language, history, and our personal lives, to nurture the emotional, the spiritual, and the political, to work against facets of oppression. Yearn time. When I watched Waiting to Exhale with my girl cousins, Tasha and Courtney, they said I had to play Robin. So I anticipated the married men, the abortion, the blood, references to the lady in blue. Everyone who knew I was pregnant told me to keep it. I did not keep it. Though it hurt to be there in the room alone, to have him waiting for me to say I'd done it. Just days after the procedure, I wanted to be pregnant again. But now sometimes I say I took care of that shit, that I would never give birth to a stupid nigga's baby. Body dancer. For years, I was a dancer, learning to use my body from a tall, brown woman named Miss April. She is the first woman who taught me to isolate my hips, to lift my sternum, to balance the chakras with breath, to balance the body, and flat backs and jazz turns. What a coincidence. A few weeks ago, I found her on Facebook living near Kansas City. I want to know if she remembers me when I began and when I quit all of a sudden in the middle of her summer intensive. I want to ask her if she could teach me again to be whole. Give me permission to leap, to exist between vinyl and page and sound and body and grit, to sweat my yearning. My mother is dead. The one who sold her 2 African print pillows is dead or died too soon. She stopped sewing with her hands and her breath. I don't ever want anything, or even my own body, to stop me the way my mother was stopped. Erotically satisfying experiences appear both in the content and form of Black women's poetry, including in Ntozake Shange's choreo poem for colored girls who considered suicide when the rainbow was enough. Another text that informs my writing. Several of the women speakers share their difficult experiences of rape, domestic violence, abortion, and loss. They discuss how they cope with the difficulty of being Black or brown and a woman in a racist, sexist society. The lady in blue, who I reference in my poem, states, "We gotta dance to keep from crying." And the lady in brown replies, "We gotta dance to keep from dying." Dance offers escape and healing from violence and trauma, a moment in which they direct their own bodies and lives. Explicit choreography calls for the 7 women to dance erotically, singing to make music as they perform their monologues. The choreography and singing are elements of the poem, as its language or creative energy evokes the experience through the body's movement. And I'll talk a little bit about performance a little later. At the end of the choreo poem, the speakers are singing, "I found God in myself and I loved her fiercely," affirming their erotic power to live and love themselves. After the gym. Tonight, I ran 2 miles at the gym, then went to see the weed man. He is a tall, white, lanky thing who always packs a 4th into a Ziploc bag for me. I think he is sexy because he moves slowly and looks me in the eye when he takes my cash. I always smile at him and imagine us fucking. I think I must like white men too. Tonight, I am sitting in the middle of my bed, surrounded by crystals. I believe I am a witch, living off moons and vibrations, smoking the purple he gave me, running back Alice Walker lines. I think maybe it will piss God off if I don't notice myself too, the way my thighs have come to look like an athlete's thighs. I remember the time a white woman looked me up and down while I was getting dressed in the gym's locker room. She said, "I must have always been this thin and pretty." She joked how she'd keep her man from me if he were still alive. Tonight, I remember that I used to dream of only dancing and the way a leotard might fit me now, or even jazz shoes. I've wanted to be a famous woman, books written about the use of my body. Ritual number 30. Today I showered and prayed over my body for the first time in a long time. I told my godmother, it is time, I want to be my own best thing. How do I begin? She suggested lavender and honey tea over turmeric and also asked if I smudged my crystals lately. No, I told her. Then I put a black obsidian yoni egg inside me and smoked weed all day. I figure all I need is company sometimes, not to have my space invaded by love that ain't love at all. How do I be angry? How do I come back to myself or what I've always wanted? How come there are so many women in my private Facebook groups asking how to leave or move on? When I asked my brother, he said, shit, do it like mommy. Be blunt, like the time she pulled out a 9-shot 22 on my stepfather. Told him if Miss Bernadette is that good to him, then take his red ass down there to be with her, you stupid motherfucker. I listen to podcasts each morning now, learn to laugh at men, then reread Miss Sanchez, learn to gaze at myself instead of turning away, learn to run myself water and bathe and drink wine and make love to men like a single woman, learn to become political about my yearning, erotic about my healing. In her 1981 essay, The Uses of Anger, Women Responding to Racism, Audre Lorde argues that anger, focused with precision, is a tool for radical change, a powerful source of energy appropriate for responding to racism, to exclusion, to betrayal, to the assumptions underlying the lives of women and women of color. Women taught to fear anger often recognize this energy as destructive to the image of womanhood and a divisive tool instead of a source of information and empowerment. Lorde provides actual instances of women's refusal to acknowledge anger as a valuable tool against oppression, the ways in which women might use anger as an act toward survival in a patriarchal world. The encounters that she relives reveal attempts to vilify the anger of Black women, calling their expressions of rage threats to the progress and understanding between women and of different racial backgrounds. Their responses to Black women's rage refuse to examine the intersections of Black women's lives, ultimately denying it a space in the feminist movement. I'm also thinking of Claudia Rankine's book Citizen, where she writes about Serena Williams and the implications of expressing anger for Black women. Body in the locker room. In the locker room, we are all naked or wrapped in white towels. Towels too small to fit my thick ass frame, so I have to tie the white towel mostly at the waist and let my brown titties bounce out loud in front of white women in mirrors. In the mirror, I am the only Black body. The two Latina women tease each other's brown bodies, say to each other, "You white as fuck today." Replace brown for pale and talk about tanning as I laugh and polish my tender brown skin with coconut oil and take down my hair. The white woman next to me asks how long I've been growing it. She says she has always wondered how Black women do that shit. Tie their coarse Black hair in knots. She asks if she can touch it. I tell the bitch no. I want to ask her if she learned that shit in white women's studies. I want to ask the bitch if she went to college, if she took her white body to college. If she knew Black women don't play that shit. She asked why I'm so angry. Like all she wanted to do was touch. And I should have mentioned before that poem that I used to have this really, really long hair down to my tailbone. So that is all over now, but I've gone bald. I have resisted. I have resisted naming my dissertation after the sex and the personal, I fuck my men so good poems. I want to apologize to my neighbors, but Black women have never been able to fuck so loudly or shout about it when it isn't demanded from the body. I only fuck if the dick is political. And today the dick is good and heavy and ask me questions like, will I keep fucking him until he comes? So you might notice a confessional tone in my poems, and I'm often asked why I write so openly and so personally, especially about sexual experiences. And I hope that I can answer that question for you here. The confessional poetry of Sylvia Plath and Sexton and Adrian is often discussed in connection with second wave feminism, which began in the 1960s and lasted through the early 1980s. Attention to the relationship between power and the female body reflects second wave feminism's efforts to address sexuality and sexual violence, reproductive rights, and domesticity. Confessional women poets constructed a literary space through which women could write openly about their personal experiences as women in connection with the limitations that traditional gender roles placed on them. The confessional mode acts as a tool of collective self-definition, personal or private moments expressing agency, and a political or collective erotic desire for selfhood that rejects patriarchal versions of womanhood. 20th century confessional writers cultivate a personal voice, writing openly about love, sex, and healing within the context of larger political and social issues. In a 1966 interview with the poet Speak, Sylvia Plath wrote, personal experience is very important, but certainly it should not be a kind of shut box or mere looking experience. It should be relevant to larger things, the bigger things. The speaker in confessional poems, The I, often reflects the process of writing, naming, and sharing personal or private moments as critical for revising oneself, or for casting off patriarchal scripts of womanhood and sexuality, of racist, sexist history, or damaging sexual politics. I have always been interested in personal poetry. Many of the Def Jam poets I watched growing up performed political poems about race, gender, class, and sexuality. They also performed poems with autobiographical details in connection with political subjects. During my sophomore year of college, way back, I encountered and became interested in the politicization of anger and women's confessional poetry of the 1950s and 60s. Raw, open, and direct, it responds to the precarious positionality derived from real experiences of marriage, motherhood, and mental illness. For me, confessional anger emphasizes and validates. It allows the reader to follow the speaker in my poems through her encounters in both public and private spaces, which are predominantly white, including the locker rooms and yoga class. The exploration of the personal as an erotic force in the confessional poetry of Plath, Sexton, and Rich informed several of the poems in oppositional writing in Like Kansas and also in uses of my body. Plath has these erotic elegies, and one of them is titled Daddy. It explored Plath's personal anger and grief toward her father's presence in her life, as well as his death. The development of control over her body and voice is driven by Plath's critique of several violent patriarchal figures as representations of her father. Likewise, my erotic elegies, though directed at my mother, address and confront the presence of a male or patriarchal figures and the gaze as denying her agency and affirming fear in her power. Like Plath's elegies, at times they flirt with death or the personal desire to die as an oppositional strategy to freeing and owning the self, or revising the existence of the self outside of patriarchal ways of living. I question if my mother's decision to risk her life by undergoing weight loss surgery was related to Black women's desire to feel weightless and beautiful in a world that has treated them so poorly and has wanted them dead. The confessional mourning of our parents is this tool in pairing the personal and the political, specifically locating and taking back the self from our often damaging politics and personal histories. Like Adrian Rich in her canonical poem, Diving into the Wreck, I use my anger with her decision and my conflict with patriarchal attitudes to assist me in revising and dismantling those narratives that reinforce a negative sense of self. So I'm going to go ahead and turn to my erotic elegy from my mother. Deliberate. Maybe she was deliberate. Maybe she wanted to die because her body weighed so heavy on her brown or her man. The surgery was never made to work for her. Being beautiful, being Black and a woman is difficult. I must be deliberate. I know now. Men misread my dissertation, my poems, want to fuck me. Men ask me if I'm a witch, if I know magic, because my oils and my remedies sit on my bathroom counter and next to my bed, ready for use. I could heal at any moment, make a body soften, the uterus still with molasses and raspberry leaves. A man in Texas said, however, it is mostly my long hair and my almond-like eyes that made him ask for me or demand I touch him, that my body is a prayer, the one where they say they won't ever do it again. But these days, I'm on my poetics so heavy, my anger so deliberate. I'm like, nah, don't touch me. And fuck the woman who spread my news across the internet then wanted me back. She can't have me back. Fuck the street that broke my mother because I grew up there too. The same men bothered me, tell me I look just like her. And Kansas, and every white bitch that has tried me or has touched me, and the man who left me in Kansas loving him. I cried and I cried until he had a baby on me. Now I'm like, nah. Once you called me woman, I know what commitment is. Perhaps I'll die unkept, or perhaps I enjoy being wanted dead. Maybe like my mother, whom I believe was so beautiful. At 8, I witnessed her staring into her vanity mirror each morning, applying makeup and perfume, listening to Black Street. We sung together, "Don't leave me, girl." And she left me. It's psychic. I believe she anticipated her death, wrote it down for years in her journal, some erotic spell, my living erotic, less about being wanted alive now. My mother refused to give me up the way her mother gave her up, or the way she was made up to give up Tiffany, my sister. She doesn't kill me the way I made blood out of my first child who I wanted. Our wombs are not dangerous. Wounded, maybe. Fact is, B never deserved my children. He still wants to come in me, even if it means I'd have to do it again. Much like contemporary poets of color, such as Morgan Parker, Robin Cost-Lewis, and Carmen Giménez-Smith, who interrogate patriarchal and feminist art and history, my poems allude to 20th century Black women's novels, such as Anne Petry's The Street and Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. I set out to examine perceptions and narratives of Black womanhood that inhibit and circumscribe women's behavior and actions. I intended to express interest in the various ways in which Black women across periods and traditions encounter oppression, as well as how Black women writers choose to respond to the positionality and contribute to the representation of Black women as multiple and complex persons, valued subjects through their poems. Like many Black feminist texts, by interrogating the gaze, I wanted to construct a radical Black female subjectivity through which Black women address the functionality of personal and sexual agency, critiquing and defining the gaze in search of self. In Robin Cost-Lewis's poem, Lure, the speaker wishes to separate her physical body and memory from instances of sexual assault against her by a family member. Similar to Lewis's poem, I consider how power lures itself into my Black female body without permission. Poems, and you'll hear later, such as Limber and Blue Time, and Toward the Body, attempt to convey a deliberate yearning to recover the spirit and body from patriarchal trauma experience in the toxic relationships and abortion clinics, and a yearning to ultimately own the truly erotic self. My confessional poems also illustrate a journey toward reclaiming language for writing the self, the grit and anger of my written word and oral performances, as well as themes of sexuality and femininity, are supported by colloquial and explicit or sexual phrases, much like the work of blues women and confessional poet Morgan Parker. In her poem, All They Want Is My Pussy, My Money, My Blood, and I got the chance to read this with students yesterday, which is really, really cool. But she makes clear a connection between the haunting and hypersexualization of Black women and the speaker's rage, depression, and isolation. She says, I do whatever I want because I could die at any minute. I don't mean YOLO. I mean, they are haunting me. I know my pussy is good because they said so. The poem's tone reflects the speaker's yearning and desire, as well as her attempt to examine her reality as a joke being played on her. She writes, okay, so I'm Black in America, right? And I walk into a bar. The explicit and highly sexual language in my confessional and spoken word poem, such as Body in the Locker Room, is necessary in portraying and embodying raw anger and desire, unstifled and unvilified by the white imagination. I wanted to produce a confessional or autobiographical revision of womanhood, motivated by my desire to achieve feminine agency. In uses of my body, I wanted to demonstrate a desire to create art that revises traditional notions of Black femininity and empowers women, even with my complicated positionality as a Black woman. The confessional poem for me becomes a violent trace of history crafted to pull the body from shame and decay into power over language and self. In her poem, Parts of an Autobiography, Carmen Gimenez Smith writes, confessional implies shame, whereas a scar is a trace of violence, and it's always connected to a narrative about the body. It is more than confession, perhaps emblem. Notes on pleasure. The nurse called the tissue sticking out of my ring finger a defensive wound. She was surprised by my survival, that I did not go unconscious under your attack. At my last visit, my therapist asked, what is it like to have once loved you, to have let you love me? I think he meant to ask, what is it like to have loved the person who abused you, battled your body? Mostly, I said, it is like being manipulated, not even being able to grieve the sex without fighting myself, your strange fists balled up, turning over and over again inside me. I beg myself not to become wet or mostly sick, throw up at memories of being pleasured by you. I still want to burn up your shit, the clothes you left in the baskets, your vision board torn beneath my bed now, even the only picture of your dead grandmother in her youth. I still want to drop the plant you gifted me over the balcony outside of my 3rd floor apartment. I want the ceramic to shatter, the shiny petals to tear on the thorns of concrete roses. However, I have named her, have repotted her in a bigger pot since she began to tilt in the one you brought. Bloom time. Mostly I lied to my therapist when he asked if I had ever thought about being unfaithful to the woman I was with. I mean, how do I say to this mindful ass white man, I am a bad woman too, or I'm not so good at being good to anybody. In other words, I cheat on niggas because they deserve it. When I told my best friend I did it because the relationship was heavy, a trauma I'd never imagined carrying, and I just wanted some whole ass shit popping in my apartment again, he said, welcome back. Welcome back. You're a bad bitch, beloved. You can have anything you've wanted. I said, you're right. You're right. I didn't leave her immediately, but I did leave. Women poets of color undoubtedly complicate the confessional mode and its use of personal lens for exploring race and class in addition to sexuality and gender. Representing concerns of Black feminism, they view the erotic as a journey towards selfhood in which Black women must consider the ways in which a racist, sexist history has affected their personal lives and choices regarding their bodies as well as their writing. They examine the impact of patriarchy in silencing anger and erotic knowledge, stifling the development and sustenance of their power as Black women in distinctly different ways from white women. Black women's poetry employs intersectionality as a strategy for explaining their lives. They evoke confrontation and subversion as central aspects of their confessional writing, a direct link to the erotic or oppositional poetics. Though Morgan Parker does not identify as a confessional poet, she recognizes the mode's power in revealing the personal to interrogate popular culture and history as it relates to Black women's experiences. In her book, Other People's Comfort Keeps Me Up at Night, Morgan Parker employs an unapologetic voice as she works to achieve a vision of herself in American patriarchal culture. She has a series of poems titled Miss Black America, and she charts, and her charting and dissection of popular culture in the confessional mode illustrates the ways in which interiority is bound to an examination of culture. At the center of Robin Cost Lewis' Voyage of the Sable Venus is her epic title poem that draws on her interest in visual art to explain the Black female body. She examines Black female figures in Western art from 38,000 BC to the present, looking at the ways in which Black women as clocks, paddles, armless, and headless offer evidence of their long history as possessions, objects, and devalued subjects. Lewis bookends and weaves throughout her lyric poems self-portraits and descriptions of art Black women that interrogate race and gender as upheld by institutions of art and history. As she states prior to the title poem, she intended to pay homage to Black women as she examined their responses to their precarious positionality. Lewis's collection routes the Black female body away from terror and patriarchal versions of the Venus as a sex object, or as sex in an object, and toward beauty, love, and empowerment. I also intended for my own work to explore how history, power, and convention justify assaults on the speaker's body and prevent contact with the self. The personal is political and the personal is historical. The confessional poem is an erotic poem. It is history's rupturing of the self and the self's revision of the ruptured self. So I'm going to transition to talking a little bit about performing. So erotic performances. The first memories I have of myself as a performer date back to my enrollment in Ballet Met in Columbus, Ohio. From age 8 to around age 15, I studied Catherine Dunham, jazz, modern, and Afro-Caribbean dance forms with April Berry. Then from age 15, shortly after the passing of my mother, until I graduated high school, I danced with a hip hop dance team under the direction of Tamara White. I understood the body as an instrument in conveying emotion and tradition. Between my studies with Berry and White, I began writing poetry. The first poem I performed in front of a crowd talked about my relationship with my mother and her relationship with men. I wish I remembered the title. Deaf Poetry Jam was my introduction to poetry as a performance and oral genre. I came to understand that poems are to be read or performed, or read out loud or performed, that performing and or speaking poems emphasizes the written or manifests a poem as a form of complex expression. Growing up watching Deaf Poetry Jam, I witnessed Black and Brown poets from across the United States, as well as Black arts poets like Sonia Sanchez and Amiri Baraka, and Black popular musical artists like Jill Scott and Common recite poems, sometimes from memory, and perform them with their whole bodies and complex vocalizations. The poets, many introduced as spoken word and slam artists, were performers of their word, emphasizing written texts with voice intonations, body movement, hand gestures, and facial expressions. Black women's poetry assisted me in crafting an oppositional response to racism and sexism. Like Kansas, first existed as a written text before I began thinking about how I might draw my interest in dance and movement of spoken word to help me shape and communicate my opposition to live audiences. The body remains a significant theme in my work as I explore my reality as a Black woman in graduate school and in places outside academia. So I'll read one of my more performance poems, Limber. Look, splits so deep my pussy lips kiss the blue yoga mat I came up in here with, bitch. You so average. Cat cows, back bends, sun salutations gained. I, born this way, double Dutch, double jointed blood, Black girl, Gabby girl, Black magic, thick thighs, yes, stretched too. Hips mimic elastic. I breathe and slip, sustain the weight of your instructions in my wrist. In child's pose, I worship Misty's tiptoe, ball-pointed calves. Ask her to forgive me for being here and no longer dancing. Before, you want me. Eyes locked on my contortion, say, how beautifully limber. Then you, yoga trained, body forced, skin thinned, flip through yoga journal, study my hypermobility, practice my body in your bedroom mirror. Tell me, watch your knees. Try not to hyperextend. Rise to correct me. Say I must get headaches from good sex and stretching. Say, also be sure to level your hips. As if it is my first time blooming into half moons you couldn't imagine. You think God must have birthed broken brown bodies. Forgot to thread the joints of all the blue, black trap niggas. Look here, I'ma don't need a strap nigga, core string so live, patagusasana so steady, twisted in eagle pose, my eyes closed, you watch me. I used to excel a standing split when I used to strip. Tip 20 stuck to the back of my thighs, still not afraid of my body. Yoga right next to you like I'm your 500-hour teacher. Last name like your Savasana. Yoga right next to you because I'm even savage and mudras. And yo, your man in the back always twists his neck to see me without permission. After class told me he can't help but watch me in the mirror. Wanted to know what else stretches that wide. Sweetheart, how long you been into this? Because you do it so easy. Wondered if I saw Serena's match that day. You must be her sister Venus, he said. Body a hot yoga train of flesh. He reached out to touch me. While some dichotomize the oral and the written, maintaining that the relationship is irreconcilable, there exists a complex relationship between the written and spoken word. Voice, much like physical action, acts as a bridge between poem and audience, as well as between poet and poem. Orality puts the voice and the written word in play with each other, and the poem is performed outward from the written text, rather than this being simply recitations of it. In performing the word, Fahashima Brown states, the complicated relationship between orality and the written word must be teased out to clarify the nature of orality. She agrees that written texts all have to be related somehow, directly or indirectly, to the world of sound, the natural habitat of language to yield their meanings. Brown provides the context for understanding the ways in which African-American poets work within and extend a vernacular tradition that values the sound as well as the language itself and the communication of meaning. Manifesting words as sounds and signs through voice intonations, poets make poems sing, and they transfer everyday language into poetry. Brown writes that Black vernacular traditions or language practices of signifying prayer, testimony, and sermon, and African-American ways of speaking, intoning, and singing words lurk within the forms of African-American poetry. As such, African-American poetry, even in its written forms, the blues poem, for example, displays characteristics of oral poetry in which performance relies on word by mouth. Juxtaposing the written word with oral performance allows one to see similarities between the spoken and the written word, such as the use of meter or rhyme, rhythm, alliteration, assonance, repetition, even call and response, chorus, and refrain in spoken word poetry. Turning attention to Black women's poetry and oral narratives, particularly the employment of distinct language practices on the page and oral performances. Brown argues that Black women encode race and gender in their oral poems, and that their poems should be read and heard as assertions of African American women about their difficult lives. I'll read that again. She argues that Black women encode race and gender in their oral poems, and that their poems should be read and heard as assertions of African American women about their difficult lives. Beginning with the Black women poets, earliest poets like Lucy Terry and Phyllis Wheatley, the presence of themes, symbols, and traditions within Black vernacular culture are decidedly Black and female, relating specifically to Black women's multiple and complex quests for identity, of strategies, of protest and subversion. Listening to women's oral narratives rather than reading the written word allows audience to experience full impacts of their manipulation of language, and ultimately, I would argue, their oppositional poetics. As Angela Davis discusses in Blues Legacies in Black Feminism, the blues song and oral performances of Gertrude Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Billie Holiday are sites for examining a historical feminist consciousness that reflected the lives of working class Black families and illuminated the politics of gender and sexuality in working class Black communities in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Davis situates their songs and performances as important and distinct feminist text in the canon of African American literature, as Black feminist criticism tends to represent novels by contemporary Black women and speeches by Black feminists, so putting them on the same level as these pieces of scholarship and literature. The blues woman voice advises, it boasts and testifies in its rupturing of the fixed, damaged, and constrained Black woman or Black female body into Black women's sense of themselves as free and empowered subjects. These women produce an erotic revision of the self, the singing of their anger toward transforming gender relations and themselves outside of a white and male-dominated history and world. The nature of virality in the blues song is much like the nature of an oppositional poetics and further closing the distance between writing and experience. The oral poem, much like the blues song and Black feminist poetics, embraces, or their embrace of the Black vernacular, closes the distance between voice and resistance, written on the page, and resistance spoken. Anger and erotic knowledge is made palpable through hummed, crooned, and preached language. Employing movements or allowing them to flow from my body's memory of personal experiences of racism and sexism, my poems are articulations of Black feminist ideas of healing and resistance. The body and physical movement of that body for many women poets and me are powerful tools for creating poetry in which we communicate, resist, and respond again to our various positionalities. The movements in my performances also manifest my desire to look back, shift the gaze, as well as to defy respectability politics and fixed narratives of Black womanhood. In spoken word performances, the poet performer as griot or storyteller utilizes oral techniques and body movement to tell stories, to boast, to interact with an audience, as well as to decolonize language or knowledge about Black experiences, and it seeks to disrupt language. Some spoken word performances appropriate and subvert oral techniques and Black vernacular traditions. Black women spoken word artists working within and extending Black vernacular traditions sometimes translate their oppositional poetics as written or memorized texts into physical movement, much like Sonia Sanchez and blues women who sing their oral feminist text. Probably lost a slide, but we're fine. In the poetry of Sonia Sanchez, blues rhythms and Black vernacular convergence with direct and compact poetic forms such as the haiku and tanka. In her first collection, Homecoming, sounds of her poems extend from the blues poems of Langston Hughes and Sterling Brown. The blues poem typically explores themes of sex, longing, struggle, and despair, as well as resistance and determination. Like fellow Black artists or poets Jane Cortez and Amiri Baraka, Sanchez employs the voice as a musical instrument in her blues poems as she explores Black identity, celebrates Black culture, and addresses Black womanhood. And if you've ever seen Sonia Sanchez perform in person, it just takes your breath away. Her vocal techniques, in addition to her humming and laughter, are not always or adequately represented on the page. However, her performances convey her manipulation of sound and language as necessary in creating consciousness and resistance to various poetic forms. Sanchez's second collection, I've Been a Woman, includes an additional embrace of the blues poem. In her poem Present, she extends blues rhythms and Black vernacular tradition to articulate anger in her expression of Black feminism. She writes, "There is no place for a soft Black woman. There is no smile green enough or summertime's words warm enough to allow my growth." Sanchez calls attention to Black women who are stereotyped as strong and therefore capable of enduring repeated oppression. The poem comes between several haikus and tankas in the collection as to interrupt traditional form as well as tradition and history, which are the root cause of Black women's anger, pain, and distorted perceptions of self. In response, the speaker attempts to make history's perception of the self smaller than the self. She writes, "I see my history standing like a shy child." This reflection takes place just as she begins to give Black women agency and power over her body and spiritual growth. So she has a repetition and pauses of words such as dancing and singing and sound that come throughout the poem. And in the second half of the poem, she implies movement and indicates her potential singing of the lines, "Hey, hey, hey, yeah, yeah, yeah," with new breaths. And my singing becomes the only sound of a blue Black magical woman walking. So we see this woman coming and just this being joyous and celebrating. The speaker's erotic voice, shifting from anger and pain to a more joyous tone, resembles the voice of the blues woman who is often constrained and manipulated, but becomes sure of her anger and her power. The singing emphasizes the poems of the Black vernacular tradition to create imagery and movement that reflect Black women's freedom. If the singing were actually performed, the vocal inflections will reflect a celebration of Black women making contact with themselves. The poem's orality makes clear her longing to rewrite Black women as magical, self-confident owners of themselves in the patriarchal world. Sanchez is often honored as a predecessor of literary foremothers to contemporary Black women's poetry. Like fellow Black arts poet Amiri Baraka, she has performed in a number of contemporary Black spaces, including Deaf Poetry Jam. Featuring Black art poets in such spaces makes clear the ways in which their embrace of Black oral tradition parallels contemporary Black performances such as spoken word, slam, and sound poetry. Like Sanchez's blue poems and Black arts poems, spoken word often incorporates musical forms, call and response, audience engagement. So I'm also thinking of the poems that explore spoken word and slam performances such as Sarah Jones and Patricia Smith and Tracy Morris. So I want to describe their voices as representing feminist voices, this performer genre coming from Black women in particular is a tool that's used to empower themselves and also women in the audience. So not only just revising Black women in history in general, but also directing this energy toward women who are right in front of them. The women's performances assisted in the development of the spoken word movement as one of the most undiluted expressions of art available to women, particularly as a vehicle for social change. The body and mouths of contemporary Black women performance poets powerfully confronts racism and slam misogyny in a male-dominated space, excuse me. Much like the work of Black arts poets, Sonia Sanchez and Nikki Giovanni, who critiqued the social and political inequalities of the 1960s Black arts movement. So I want to think about Sarah Jones's poem, Your Revolution. She borrowed that title from Gil Scott-Heron, The Revolution Would Not Be Televised. Sarah Jones' performances of Your Revolution on Def Poetry Jam move between movement and orality as she responds to sexism in hip hop songs, the community during the 1990s. In another poem, which we also watched yesterday and talked about, Ain't I a Woman by Kay Davis. She slams 3 fingers into the air to emphasize how many times she has said no to instances of sexual assault. She holds her hands up to halt white women's idea of feminism as relying on common experiences of gender. She repeats Sojourner's Truth, Ain't I a Woman, as she turns her hands through the air to illustrate continuous and repeated marginalization and erasure of Black women's bodies and experiences and discussion of womanhood and women's rights. So spoken word allows poets to work from the body's memory to express or to reconstruct anger through movement in addition to word and sound. So thinking again about Claudia Rankine's Citizen, she argues that there's a source of actual anger invoked by racism. The use of the body in language is necessary for Black women in dismantling patriarchal narratives and communicating frustrations with racism and sexism. So just thinking beyond the page, like the poem is great, but we also need that performance to really develop that impact. Women performance poets are not performing anger or feminism, articulated or illustrated in a written text. Rather, they are embodying or assisting in the communication of it. Often in spoken word performances, women poets embody concerns of Black feminism, such as Black women's invisibility in white spaces and sexual violence justified by racist, sexist perceptions of Black womanhood. So again, movement, head movements, head gestures, all those facial expressions and non-feminist performances, they're taking those and making them significant to Black women's performances. So they manifest sexual autonomy in doing that, the desire to take up space or to gaze back as communicated through women's spoken word and written text. So a little bit about Tracy Moore, who I often have looked at as a sound poet, and many look at as a sound poet. She suggests that the physicality of words as we hear them derives from the performance poem. She has a few sound poems like A Little, where she repeats this line, I'm just a little girl, I'm just a little girl. But she varies her sound and pace and inflection of the words to compose a poem on the sexual abuse of young girls and the related feelings of sadness and isolation. She writes in her poetics essay, Sound Making Sound, that her vocal features growing up in her blues or hip hop and slam poetry, these subsets of performance poetry converge as well as diverge from them to work more with sound to create a visceral call and response. So I think we talked about that yesterday, just thinking about how performances really make us feel something in the body, in the audience. Working with the body through voice started with Morris's hip hop poem Project Princess, known for its vernacular, wordplay, and rhyming. She writes, her black thighs making guys eye, as well as his facial expressions and physical movements, characteristics of slam poetry. She speaks, almost sings, almost raps the lines of celebrations of Black women living in housing projects. She also employs this form of recitation in her sound poems, such as The Miss Gets Her Ass Kicked. In one performance of this poem, she beats her hand against her chest to create the sounds of slaps. The words she utters, such as my heart, then enter and transform into or are performed as slaps, chokes, and hyperventilation, can't talk today, to carry a narrative on domestic violence. Like in her poem, A Little, Morris repeats and violently shifts intonation to the same word or phrase to reflect the emotion and physical feelings of abuse. So the voice I use to read or perform poetry has changed over the years. Years ago, I recited verse at a rapid pace because I assumed memorization and flow to be an important measure or accomplishment of a performer's poet. Now, as I write and perform, I'm thinking more about breath, pauses, as well as vocal range and inflections to convey or evoke emotion, or to emphasize words significant to understanding the poem and my overall poetics. These decisions are sometimes represented on the page through line breaks and slashes. Both my books, like Kansas and Uses of My Body, they do employ language practices and poetic vices on the page, as well as in my oral performances. Oral performances allow me the space to experiment with the range and inflections of my voice as an artist, similarly to poets who are not identify exclusively with spoken word traditions such as Gwendolyn Brooks, Margaret Walker, and Lucille Clifton. My poems explore my feelings or experiences and often rely on oral performance as an addition to the written text to convey anger toward being treated as a sexual object, toward my mother's death, and some of the other things that I talk about. My collections seek to convey anger as necessary in examining history and critical in obtaining personal and political autonomy. So in addition to my performances, sometimes I go and create audio recordings of some of the poems, just so that I can listen over and over again and sort of hear that repetition, and just think about how that oral recording is sort of preserving my communication of Black feminism. At times, I attempt to convey grit or anger by deepening my voice. Orality in these poems not only illustrates actual anger, it is meant to push back against the attempt to stifle and vilify Black women's anger, like Audre Lorde pointed out. The oral recordings would stress the voice as an instrument in embodying my Black feminism. So I'm going to close out with a piece before I read my last paragraph. Thank you all so much for this. This has been amazing. I love speaking about my work, and I definitely enjoy performing my work. So again, my performance existing as written oral text derived from Black oral tradition and Black vernacular culture. As such, I have come to understand my role as a performer to interrupt and tell stories, and to allow the poem to become also physical actions that assist in this process. Similar to Black women spoken word poets, my poems, where I explore historical perceptions of the Black female body, often employ that movement, that demonstration of resistance. My performances, uses of my body, if you will, illustrate the location and transformation of language to dismantle myths about Black womanhood. Poem related to my body. Though I am a poet, I am often mistaken for a sprinter. Today, a man at the gas station watched me walk behind his car and asked, "You go to school here? You look like you ran track like a motherfucker." It is mostly my quads, I think. These twin four-headed muscles, 22 inches around, prefer isolation, deep squats, have pressed and quivered, resisted heavy weights, the academy, white women I teach in Pilates who ask if they can touch them. A Black woman I met at the bar joked about the girth of my arms. She asks why I work out so much if I'm just a writer and teacher, at the hurdler she thinks I am. I want to write the book about my body, something that speaks to the way I am actually built, have moved and pushed, have drenched myself in sweat. Thank you all so much again.
Thank you, Simone. We've got 90 people here.
Nice.
And I would ask you all to join us in responding and asking your questions and what you've gained, what you've learned from this. And I'll come up with you so you're not all by yourself. You might like it because you like to perform. I prefer. I don't love that, but
Thank you.
yeah. So sometimes it takes a little minute, so we'll let them I'm not seeing anything yet, so we'll just give them all a minute. I'm really interested in this idea of the confessional poetry that is always, that you do such a good job, like framing and theorizing and thinking about its history and what it's doing now, you know, what's happening to us. And I think about, like, you know, sort of the concepts of race and what they and how they impact our lives, and yet they're myths, it's fantasy, this other part of it, right? And so this kind of working through to work it through, because it goes as the source of our country. So I really appreciate how the confessional might be a way for us to be working through, you know, to hear it, to say it, to put it out, and to put it out in a way that is both personal and collective. But I'm wondering also, like, what happens, like, to something that becomes more abstract, you know, like less actual, like the blues, or you know, sort of the kind of narrative poem that's speaking in sort of everyday language. What happens? Like, are there poets? Is there part of your work that moves into a different realm, or is that not important right now, you know? So, because the confessional and the narrative is different than the literal, right? It's doing all kinds of metaphor and movement, but
Yeah, so I think a lot when I sit down to write, you know, it's always in the back of my head, you know, what's the importance of this poem, or, you know, what's going to happen once it's out in the world. And so I think I'm always thinking about, I can't stop thinking about women's lives and about how I've been shaped by writing about women's lives. And so every time I sit down, these are the things that come out. But I think, are you also asking maybe what it is when I'm just writing about just not women's lives, or about not about
yeah, maybe, or even if you are still writing about women's lives, are there ways, like how could the confessional, or how does it, or I don't know, I'm just thinking about form, and when it goes from something that is on a level that seems people will take it as your real life, you know, or whatever, right? And how are there ways that it moves into something that is still maybe talking something from that subject position, but maybe in more abstract terms? I don't really know. It's just a question if you've thought about it.
Yeah, I'll think about that some more.
For other people that do it.
Yeah, you know, when I was writing, and one of the questions about the book is, how do I write about this shit in a dissertation? You know, because we're constantly reflecting on our lives, or at least I did a lot in grad school. And so having that space, they're saying, you know, write a collection of poems. And I'm like, what do you want these poems to be about? Or, you know, what if they're just about my life? How do I sit there and ground them in history, or ground them in some sort of tradition? And the truth is, you know, they can exist within tradition, but I think they also exist outside of that. So when I'm speaking or performing to audiences who have no idea, you know, who Gwendolyn Brooks is, or who I have no idea who these confessional poets are, reading these poems right in their personal experience. This poem, or just thinking about Morgan Parker, I think a lot of her poems are deeply personal, but we also take, like we were looking at All They Want Is My Pussy, My Money, My Blood yesterday. And it seems very personal on, you know, on some levels, but then you have to look between lines to be able to see that history. So I go back and forth between saying these are just personal poems and these are also historical poems, because I can't live without history. So there's nothing that I do, nothing that I write that is absent of that. Yeah.
Right.
I'm still thinking about that question.
Okay, so Brad Proctor has got something up here. Thank you so much for this performance and your framing comments. It was amazing. I'm
Thank
teaching
you.
a class on Black social movements, and we have talked some about the intersections between art and activism. Could you talk a little more about the ways, what ways in which your poems and performances are kind of strategy for broader liberation, and to what extent are they acts of liberation in and of themselves?
That's a really good question. Whew, so I think I'll take from my last answer. So when I'm performing pieces, and I don't always think of myself as a performance poet, I think that was like put on me. And so now I'm thinking about myself as a performance poet constantly. I grew up in this tradition, so I never thought of poetry as distinct from oral poetry, written poetry as distinct from it. But I will say when I'm performing for public spaces, being able to perform for women, again, who are not sitting in classrooms studying social movements, sitting in classrooms studying feminism, I think it allows them to be able to see themselves and then how they might be able to construct their own resistance or their own liberation. I mean, that happened for me as a poet. I was sitting in open mics and workshops, and I was hearing, women claim their lives, women talking about all the things that they've been through. And I'm like, I can write this too, or I can take what you've written and be able to free myself in some ways. Even that, even just the anger or the grit of those poems, I was able to receive and use in my own life. So I'm hoping that the same thing is able to happen for people who are encountering my performances as well.
Yeah, and I would say also like the liberatory might be just the way you think. Not even the specifics, right? But some of that framing. Someone, Artel Kelly, is willing to comment. Do you want to speak, Artel? Or do you want me to read this? If you want to speak, maybe raise your hand if you can. Okay, there we go. All right, great. Let's hear you. So you have to, hopefully you get unmuted. Oh. There we go. We can't hear you.
Oh, I don't know what to push. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. I wrote a lot of stuff while you were speaking, and it was shocking. I mean, I found myself being defensive in the beginning, but thanks to Evergreen, I overcame that very quickly. Still, I must say, I'm kind of scared of you. It's both a healthy, but erotic fear. The blend of social justice and personal freedom, the collective, I guess, being our goal, but the personal also to save our souls.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're courageous and you really
Thank
put it out there. I mean, it's kind of nice for me. I kind of can embrace, I'm a recovering drug addict, so I've been down many roads.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of shameful about my erotic past, but you've kind of allowed me to embrace it and maybe celebrate it. It's not so much shameful. You just open the door for us to be real, really real. And that's what I've had to learn to overcome white privilege. I mean, 5 years ago, if I'd heard the term white privilege, I would have told you were full of shit, and now I totally am an agent of change. And I try to share that, and I see you doing that in the same way, but different. I'll shut up.
You.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for sharing your story. Yeah, and I was looking at your question. Is it more on a personal or collective level? And I would say it has to be both. I have sisters. I'm a Black woman. I'm friends with tons of Black women, and so my job as a poet, of course, I encounter poetry, or I write poetry for me. But I'm also thinking about, again, what are my friends experiencing? What did my mother experience? And how can I interrogate that, reflect on that to make sure that I'm good, that I'm able to, give to my children one day this art of healing. Yeah, thank you.
So you can see these questions there, and either of these, both of them have to do with how it appears to be so personal. The first one that Lindy asks is about the relationship of the traumatic and getting distance, sort of critical distance on it, I guess.
Let me read it. Whew, you know, it is so, I don't know if I have an answer to this question, because even as I'm reading, I want to cry. You know, like poems that I'm performing, I can feel the tears welling up. I can feel that trauma. Sometimes it's hard to be performing a poem knowing that these things have really happened to me, and to know that I can't say everything about everything that's happened to me, or this poem is not going to heal me completely. And so to be able to put it out there and for readers to be able to do what they want to do with it or receive it however they want to, but knowing that, again, I've put this out there as a way for me to process it, and as a way for us to maybe speak about, you know, these issues that are affecting our personal lives, like domestic violence, or when it comes to women changing or getting surgery in order to fit some sort of ideal beauty standard.
The deadliness of it, yeah. And then there's another question here from Sam. Because your poetry comes from such personal experiences, I'm wondering if performing your pieces provides extra element. So I think you've just sort of said that. Is it hard to decide what you choose to share? Let it all out. And then the second, there's another person following up, Carla, who asks a question like, what advice do you have to encourage someone to let go of fear about speaking their mind and being vulnerable? Yeah.
You know, I think I've always been in spaces, and this might speak to why I'm so open. People are like, you tell everything. Not everything is there. You know, some details, of course, have been, you know, taken from here and there. There aren't always, you know, a complete story, complete narrative there. But I've always been a part of communities that share. Again, I was first drawn to journal writing as a child. I would write down everything. And that was my way of not thinking about my experience, but being able to go back and say, again, these things happened to me, you know, where was I 5 years ago? You know, what is my thinking now? Let me answer the second part of that question. I'm struggling with deciding how to be vulnerable. You know, I just hope that when I'm reading and performing these pieces that they land on, you know, ears who are compassionate and that can maybe offer me something even as a performer up here. So I just really hope that, again, in the ways that Audre Lorde put out there, that we have this erotic power, that maybe my openness, my vulnerability can allow other women to be vulnerable or other people to be vulnerable. And from there, be able to start to develop, again, some sort of plan or some sort of rituals toward healing. You know, this book for me is full of rituals that I've learned from my godmother, from my mother, and again, knowing what to avoid, you know, those violent, deadly things that take away from our power. Yeah. And then advice for, you know, just write. You know, not everything has to be out in the world. You know, there are things that I've kept, you know, locked away, but to really choose who you're sharing your work with. You know, publishing in journals is a process that some writers go through. And so, you know, really looking at these journals to see who is editing, who they're sharing with, just to make sure, again, just because it's out there doesn't mean it needs to be out there to anybody. You know, people need to be able to still hold and take care of your work. So I would say to seek spaces where you can be open.
Prita, do you want to ask the question, or you can just write it in the chat? We can read it, but also it's lovely to hear from people. I would just need you to raise your hand if you want, otherwise we'll just read it.
Okay, sure, I can. Great. Yeah, also thank you, Simone, for sharing your poetry and your processes with us, and just being so vulnerable and kind of modeling that for us, for our community. And I'm teaching with Brad for the same program, and I just was wondering if you could repeat the Audre Lorde quote that you shared about anger focused with precision, and then maybe just speak a little bit more about how you see poetry as part of that process of sort of transforming or kind of shifting anger into precision.
Yeah, I threw all my papers on the floor, so I don't have the quote verbatim. But she says that, anger focused with precision can be transformative. And I go back and forth with that, because I'm like, if I'm angry and somebody has touched me or violated me, I'm going to be angry. But I'm also thinking about, okay, if I'm a poet as well, and I am charging myself with reflecting on these experiences, how am I really pulling all that anger together into a performance? Like yesterday, we watched a piece by Shasperey entitled "Black Girl Magic," where she's visibly angry. Like this is not just a poem. We know that the experiences that she's reflecting on have evoked real anger. And so I think poetry can be a part of, and I will say that it will allow people escape from that anger. So I can stand up there and I can talk about how many white women have touched my hair, how many white women have touched me. And the audience can receive that, but they're not actually receiving that anger. They'll walk away, but if I'm talking to a friend about this, I think that's where actual movement is happening. I had a couple of people from a performance a couple of years ago after I mentioned how angry I was about this woman touching my hair, and they came up and joked about it. And so it's really, I think, about how audiences maybe are positioning themselves, how readers are looking at those performances, how they're receiving those performances, that makes anger also transformative. It's not just the poet, not just the performance, but also, again, what people are doing with that anger.
Yeah, cool, great, thank you.
We have time for one more question. If anyone is something that they're afraid to ask, or practice, get up here. Here we go. Okay, Isadora.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this might be a strange question. You came to our class Black Girl Magic yesterday, and I was very good.
Can you speak up, Isadora? It's a little hard to hear you.
Yeah, you came to the Black Girl Magic class yesterday, which I am in, and it was great to see you there. And I'd like to ask you another question. How you say a lot of your poetry revolves around like the body, and I was just wondering, this is sort of a philosophical question, but how much of the self, when you think about the self, how much of the self do you think is the body, and how much do you think is like everything else?
Ooh,
like
that
the
is
mind or the
a deep
emotions?
question. Now, and I think as I was reading, I was thinking about, and I think about this every day, that, and I hope this answers your question, that it's impossible for me to exist without my body. Like literally the way that I think, the way that people receive me, they see this Black woman first. And so much of what I process has to do with my body. I'm constantly thinking about my mother, her decisions, what I do every day. I go to the gym every day. I work out really, really hard. And that helps me to develop openness. It helps me develop strength. And so I think constantly of the ways in which what I'm doing with my actual physical body demonstrate what's going on within the self. So I think there can be some separation, but at least for me and what I'm thinking about right now, what I do with myself has everything to do with, or has mostly to do with my physical body, even down to meditation and stillness, we're quieting our minds, we're, investigating and thinking about, or trying to come back to breath. That's a very physical thing. So just noting again, and I hope this answers your question, noting again that connection between all of this movement and then how I'm feeling or how I'm expressing.
Thank you. Yeah, that was very good. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Simone, for visiting and coming. I hope you come to our campus sometime. We would love to have you to this crazy part of this country, way up in this northwest corner. And good luck with your book. And we hope to have you back. Thank you again.
Yes, thank you all so much. I really enjoyed this. And thank you, Asha. I just saw another comment down in the chat. Thank you all so much.
All right. Bye.
Bye.